So again, I'm super excited to bring you guys another speaker. As you can see, this whole quarter has been Dr. Watkins' good friends who she really wants to hang out with for a day. Emery's laughing at me in the back. So Dr. Celeste Chavis and I have known each other for a long time. It actually occurred to me somewhat recently in anticipation of her visit that I think the first time I met her was actually when we were both still PhD students. She did her PhD just up the road and her master's degree at Berkeley. Before that, she had done her undergrad at Ohio State. And she has now been at Morgan State, which is a historically Black college university in Baltimore, Maryland. She's been there for a decade now as a faculty member and currently as the interim associate dean of undergrad studies in the School of Engineering there at Morgan State. So Celeste is going to tell you about her research, which is very applicable to lots of us here, but also a little bit about her journey into academia, how HBCUs work and things like that. So I will turn it over.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. So yeah, I decided to be probably a little non-traditional for a research seminar, but I know you guys are winding down the academic year. So probably like it'll be half research and then half other stuff. I always like to make a point, particularly when I come to the West Coast where you guys do not have HBCUs, to kind of talk a little bit about what they are and give some context and things. And then I'll talk a little about some of my other research areas. I do a lot of equity work, but the talk, for example, today has no equity elements to it. So I'll just give a little bit of flavor about some of the other stuff that I do. Please feel free to ask questions as I go. I'm very informal. No question is, you can ask anything. I'm an open book. And as you'll see probably as I talk, I'm very transparent about things. So we'll just get started. So I like to know, I guess, who all is in the audience. I believe are you guys mostly doctoral students? If you're doctoral, raise your hand. Okay, master's students, undergraduate students. Okay, so a little bit more masters.
We have some staff.
And then staff, faculty, other folks. Okay, good seeing you again. Excellent. So yeah, so I asked that because you're probably gonna be like, well, why is she telling you guys what HBCU is? Why should I care? Well, there's many reasons you should care. One, I assume some of the doctoral students will one day want to enter academia, and it is a viable path for being a teacher and researcher. So that's one reason. Two, I assume all you brilliant students will one day be managers and be hiring people. And I want to make sure that you consider people from all institutions, not just the Berkeleys of the world. And so that's why I make a point to say this when I'm at other places. Anecdotally, so you've heard in my bio that I'm a graduate of UC Berkeley. I'll never forget the first TRB I attended as faculty as opposed to as a doctoral student. So you would think that now that I'm faculty, the dynamics would be different, but it was actually really fascinating because I had the Berkeley tag, when I went to TRB before. Everybody wanted to talk to you, who's your advisor, who's this. Then you come with the Morgan State that people don't know about. And suddenly people just look right through you. Nobody stops and chats with you at the receptions and all these things, even though I'm a professor now and I was a mere student before. And so I just want people, we should all be cognizant of our bias. So that's why I do that. So you don't know, the background of the people just from the school that they're at. So the alphabet soup. So as you heard, Morgan State is an HBCU. You guys all know what that stands for? Anybody want to say it?
Historic Black College University.
Excellent. And it is one of 4 types of MSIs. You guys know what MSI stands for?
Yeah, definitely not the gaming.
No, not the gaming. But yes, I heard somebody say minority serving institution. What is it? HSI? Hispanic serving institution. Now we're gonna get to probably the tougher ones. TCU.
Tribal.
Yep, tribal colleges and universities. And the tough one, which they say, what is it? Anapeasy is the way they actually pronounce it as sound, Anapeasy. This is the newest one, started in like 2008. That's the
Asian
tricky one.
American and Pacific Islander.
Yeah, Asian American and Native American Pacific Islander serving institutions. It's a mouthful. So those are the 4 categories of minority serving institutions. One of the things you'll notice that for HBCUs is the historic piece. So not all HBCUs are even predominantly Black anymore. Majority still are, but it's historically Black colleges and universities. These are all universities that were founded prior to 1964 for the primary purpose of educating African Americans. Anybody know why 1964 is the year they chose and the importance of 1964?
The Civil Rights Act.
Yes, excellent. Yes, so it's the institutions that were founded prior to the Civil Rights Act, which basically required higher education institutions to open up to everyone. There's many other things as part of the Civil Rights Act, but there was a component that required higher ed institutions to be more inclusive. And so any institution founded before for serving African Americans is considered an HBCU. Hispanic serving institutions are about the percentage of Hispanics who are serving today. So that's one of the differences. So 25% of your total undergraduate enrollment need to be Hispanic students. There are many HSIs in California. Tribal colleges and universities were basically founded in relatively remote areas for the primary purpose of providing access to education to the Native American population. And then lastly, the newest one is institutions whose goal is to educate Asian American and Native American Pacific Islanders who are also low income. So they have a requirement that institution, I believe, also has to be 50% Pell Grant recipients. So that does, limit who can fall under that designation.
Pilgrim recipients?
Pell Grant, which is basically low income status. So it means that students are eligible for Pell Grant, and to be eligible for Pell Grants is based on your household income.
Arts grants.
So Pell Grants are what it's a loan, right, for students?
Yeah.
It's a government loan that we have for students who fall under a certain economic threshold. And so they require to have the last designation that at least half of the students that you serve are eligible for Pell Grants, meaning that they're lower income. So those are the 4. And basically the status allows universities to go after some specialized funding, depending on which of the statuses that you fall under. So HBCUs are of course near and dear to my heart. I am American. My family goes back to slavery days, so a multi-generational American. And so if you notice, HBCUs are prominently in the South, right, where slavery was dominant. So you'll see there are some in the Northeast where I'm from in Ohio, but a lot of them will be in Alabama, Georgia, Carolinas, etc. So we have 101, 102 HBCUs today. You can see where they are. I'm in Maryland, which of course is just outside of DC. And yep, they've been around for now over 100 years, a lot of them. I think Morgan State, we just celebrated 150 years. Yeah, so we've been around for a long time. And those are my grandparents who are graduates of HBCUs. My grandmother graduated from Fisk and Meharry, and my grandfather from Tuskegee in Tennessee. He's 99 years old, still alive. He was an educator, so this is why I do what I do. So he went to World War II, was able to go to school after joining the military, but he could only go to the HBCUs at the time he went to school. And so people think it's really far away, but 1964, my mom was born before the Civil Rights Act. So this is we're not that far away. And his grandfather was born enslaved. So, we're really, really not that far out. So HBCUs today. So one of, I guess, the beauties of HBCUs is that historic element, and they do have a unique culture. Here is the illustrious Morgan State Band. We saw them live, they're really fun times. So we're known, you know, culture is a lot different at HBCUs than other institutions. Bands are very popular. You can see this is from graduation. So they're open to all. It basically just means that it was founded, you know, for the purpose of serving African Americans, but now everybody goes. On average, still we're like 75% Black, but as I said before, there are some HBCUs that aren't even majority Black anymore. But one of the things is we do have a high percentage of Pell Grant recipients, meaning more affordable than our larger institutions and neighboring institutions. And when it comes to STEM, we produce 20% of Black STEM graduates, even though we are not 20% of universities. And 25% of all Black doctoral students got their start at a HBCU. So they still serve a huge and important purpose. And I say this because our faculty is not predominantly Black. Our faculty is very diverse. But I think it's important that whatever school, if you decide to be an educator, you know the history of the school that you're at, you understand the students which you're serving, because every school has different dynamics with who you're serving. And it's not homogenous across, you know, HBCUs either. So what we do well is retaining and graduating first generation and lower income students of all types, but historically African American students. So that's my spiel on HBCUs and why they're amazing and wonderful and still important today. And if you choose to teach at one, it's an honor. And I hope you do consider, because one of the goals is oftentimes people want to be at like the most known school and things like that, but you can do very meaningful research and work anywhere, I feel, as long as the work is good. So, I get to, work with great people all over the place, even though I may not be at one of the most known schools. Now, there are some caveats. Teaching load is a little heavier, but some people like to teach more than they like research or like a balance. So, decide what your mission is, I guess. Any questions before I transition?
Do you have information like what percentage of are like women versus men?
Oh, at the school,
Is
at the professor level or the student level? I think Oregon is probably 60% female, so like 60-40 roughly. I don't know if it's like that at all schools, but yeah, ours I think is definitely a little bit more female than men. Now in engineering, look, that number is not true in engineering, but in some of the other programs, it's maybe more like 70-30.
And faculty?
Faculty, it also varies by program. I think we may be getting close to 50-50, but some programs are better than others. Engineering, we're probably like 60-40, 60% male, 40% women. We do a decent job, yeah. Any other questions? All right, and then I have to plug my personal program. Where I come from is the transportation department. We are the nation's first and only undergraduate transportation program that is like ABET accredited. So unlike most schools, so we're under the School of Engineering, but we're not under civil. So our students get a degree in transportation engineering, not civil engineering, which is pretty unique. And so we cover like classes in engineering, logistics, planning, some management and other miscellaneous things. We are R2 research institution, so that's the middle category for research. We have a pretty known university transportation center that we love to partner with great people through. And we, of course, are HBCU in Baltimore, Maryland. All right, so that was that part. So now I will talk about what I do, some my different research areas, and then we'll talk about the e-bike projects. Okay, so this was me as a young, fresh-faced professor in January 2013 when I started and had no gray hair. So why I chose Morgan State? So I like to, divert. So I chose Morgan State for a couple of things. I knew that I really liked teaching. And so I wanted to be at a school that valued teaching, and that's not everywhere. I don't know what life is like here, I'm not speaking name, I'm just saying it's not everywhere. So I wanted to be at a school that really valued teaching, but also I could be productive in research. So we've had a university transportation center for many, many years. So I knew that there was funding in the area that I wanted to do. I wanted to be in a city. I wanted to be able to get my hair done. Those are like my requirements coming up. It doesn't seem like much, but you'd be surprised where most engineering schools are located. And I was just not willing to move to some of those places. So that was my criteria and it fit perfectly. And so as you heard, I'm the interim associate dean. I would say I kind of fell into that role. I've been at the university for 10 years. I started the role in the middle of the pandemic, but it's been a great opportunity. So, sometimes opportunities come your way and they end up leading to other opportunities. So, for example, AVET. You guys are shielded from this, but basically it is not fun for your faculty because you have to do all this data collection to make sure that students are achieving outcomes. And then you have to write a report every 6 years for your institution, your program to maintain accreditation. I had the dishonor of being the one to write that report for my program in 2017. Notice I was not tenured then. And somehow I got that responsibility. And so that was kind of like the first of like my administrative stuff. We got accreditation with no problems, which was great. Then I got tenure. I was like, well, you can't not give me tenure if I'm doing accreditation. I was like, I'm gonna burn all the documents if I don't get it. But I got tenure. So I became a professor in 2018, celebrating with some colleagues who also had gotten tenure then. Then I became the instructional technology coordinator. Well, I was already the instructional technology committee member for engineering, and then COVID hit. And then my little easy volunteer role, which was just learning about software that I already like to use anyway, actually became a real service role as opposed to an on paper service role. And I had the responsibility of training everyone in the School of Engineering how to teach online over an extended spring break. So that was my duties, including 60-plus-year-old professors who've been using the same slides for a couple of decades. And I was like, that's pretty cool. Why do I need to use a tablet? Why do I need to write in real time when I'm teaching? Can I just read from these slides? No, you cannot. So that was 2020. Then fortunately, so then the dean role opened up. The person I'm in for went to NSF as a program director, and they needed somebody to take her place. And I guess I did a good enough job getting us through the worst of COVID that I was offered that position. And for us, that's very unusual. They almost never give associate dean positions to non-full professors. I guess because it was only interim, they made an exception. So I took that on in 2021. For my women in the room, I had a baby also at the end of that year. I literally was offered the position, and then we found out that we were having a lovely bundle of joy about 3 weeks after I accepted said position. Mind you, I accepted the position for somebody who was on leave, and I was like, I'm gonna need to go out on leave. But they were very wonderful. And as you see, I worked from home with the baby at the desk. And we made it work. So actually, it was great because it was COVID, so I was able to work from home and, just put her next to me while I worked. And then I actually just found out I did get full professor, so yay. Yeah, it's been a very busy 10 years. And then there's research. So my research areas are, so it's interesting. When I came here, they're like, oh, you research bikes. And I was like, I don't consider myself a bike researcher. And let me say why. One, people who research and love bikes, like they really research and love bikes. I came, Carrie was lovely enough to give me a bike for the day. And I was like, I haven't been on a bike since before winter hit in Baltimore. So it's been a little while. So like I said, I am what I call a convenient bike rider. I am not the confident, what are the different levels of bike enthusiasts? But my philosophy when it comes to bikes are, I would love to be able to ride a bike to go short distances whenever I felt like it and feel safe, which where I live is not the case, which is why I have not been on a bike in quite a while. But I do love it when given the opportunity. So my whole goal when it comes to research, I consider myself kind of an applied researcher where Baltimore is my playground. And I like to just look at multimodal transportation from an equity lens and be the one who can talk to policymakers, community members, academics, practitioners, and be all in the same space and kind of translate across the groups. And of course, using data to kind of do that. So some of my work, as you see, is in bikes, but I do a lot of work in public transit, pedestrian as well. Really, most of my work is looking at equity-based questions, looking at who's being impacted by transportation, who's making decisions, who's involved in the decision-making process. And I like to do a lot of this using a lot of data and analytics. Today we'll be using some GIS data that we have some studies looking at, street light data and things like that. And then I do a fair amount of policy work in the city too, which has been great that there is this connection between the academic world and policy and practitioners in Baltimore that has been really great. And I'll talk about a couple of those examples too. So here's an example of one of my kind of multimodal studies. It is still bike centered. Is it not gonna say? We're going to go across the screen. There you go. Yeah. Okay. So this one in Baltimore, they tried to accommodate bikes in what you guys probably would never do here, but in the bus lane. So downtown, they allow bikes to use the red painted bus only lanes. And they're like, yeah, it seems to be doing well. We assume it's safe enough. So what we did was we flew drones at several locations downtown to look at the interaction between pedestrians and bikes. Now, as you notice in Baltimore, there is a bike.
There are no bikes.
There's a few. There was one who turned. You'll also see them randomly on the sidewalk. They don't come in too much frequency.
I see on the sidewalk
Yeah.
a lot of that.
Yeah, there's some on the sidewalks, and part of it's because there's so many right turning cars. So we looked at different intersections to see like how they were performing. Basically, bus operators were amazing. They never like try to go around the cyclists or anything. There you go, you got one. But it was the cars that posed all the problems for that lane. And then in this one was one that was a peak hour only. So where you see these cars parked was a bus lane that was actually in operation, but it wasn't painted red. So there was a lot of enforcement issues. And as you see, most of the buses don't even bother going in the lane. What's interesting in this one, that white car that just pulled up was actually a parking enforcement officer. So we actually did get to see like enforcement on the video. And so we were just looking at the safety. There was one near collision on the bike lanes during the times that we had filmed. And the ironic part was it was between a police officer and a car.
Wow.
So yeah, but other than that, it was fairly safe. There was just a lot of enforcement issues really with cars getting in who weren't turning right, because you are allowed to get in when you're turning, or who got in way too early, things like that. But there weren't a lot of bikes, as you see, that use the lanes. And we did a few just like kind of on the spot, like talk to people, but there wasn't like a formal survey, but most of the people who were using it are like, yeah, I bike everywhere, like I don't need a lane. So it was, I don't think it was reaching people like me who would love to bike if they feel safe. It was like mostly people who would have biked probably anyway, were using those lanes.
So that's one of the examples.
Let's see. Do some work with like equity and accessibility. This project actually was never a funded project. This is one of my pet projects, I would say. And it was working with Baltimore City Schools. So we are an open choice school district at the middle and high school level, which means that you can go to any school in the city. Instead of like a neighborhood model where you go to the high school closest to you. And the reason behind that is they have like specialty programs in different high schools across the city. So if you allow students to go anywhere, then you're not restricting their access to programs. But we only have public transit. There is no yellow bus service for the students. And so you have students basically crisscrossing across the city from middle school onward, and it creates these really like long and complicated commutes. And so like this map shows you in red is like where students live. And then the yellow dots are where the schools are located, the high schools are located. And the bigger the dot, the more students that can go to the school. And so it's tricky if you live in certain parts, you know, there's a lot of red clusters with no high school there. Some of the better schools are located actually in that blue strip. So like our engineering school is located smack in the middle of that center blue. And so kids will end up really crisscrossing the city to go to the better schools. And so we found, you know, like the commute times are really high. We talked to students and they discussed, you know, not wanting to transfer in certain parts of the city because they don't feel safe there, things like that. And so it's not the best map, but the thick black lines are our bus routes. And essentially they go in and out of downtown. So to get anywhere that's like across town, you kind of have to go downtown and back up. And so 1 in 4 students who commuted by public transit had times that were over 45 minutes to get to school. The school starts at like 7:30. It's pretty early, often dark in the winter. 68% required a transfer. And this was their average commute time. We have a lot of reliability issues, so you can buffer plus or minus, you know, 10, 15 minutes depending on the day. And we found that it was correlated to high absenteeism. So the students who had like the most complicated commutes were also the ones most likely to be absent a lot, particularly in that first period. And we could see like their first period, like grades were much lower when they had like the more complicated travel patterns. And so I kind of got into this work when we had a major bus redesign. So students really are about 1 out of every 8 passengers on our transit system, but they weren't really involved in the redesign process. They weren't really talked to. They basically said the goal is to make it not worse for them. I was like, well, we could make it better for them too. So that's kind of how I got involved in this and working with the city on like access to schools issues. And then the last kind of area is the policy work. This is kind of actually a little bit out of order. Well, I'll just put them all up. So I have been able to work pretty closely with various politicians and city groups on issues related to transportation. I worked on legislation where we created, legislation was passed to basically put a modal hierarchy for the city. So basically walking is the top, followed by your more sustainable modes like cycling, transit, micromobility, then your shared and commercial modes, followed by, you know, single occupancy vehicles. And basically this like requires, you know, it could be small things and larger things. Like one of the smaller things is like, if you are tearing up the street for some reason, do we need to restripe it the same way? Is it an opportunity to maybe put in a bike facility, things like that? It also has some ties to like the long range planning and making sure that, you know, certain modes are able to be higher prioritized in the rankings of projects and things. So that passed, and that's being used now in the city. Worked on the manual that went along with the legislation. I did some work on like grocery access in the city, and we ended up having a 6-month pilot program that actually came out right before COVID hit, and it was extended a little bit longer during COVID to provide subsidized rides to the grocery store. And what we found, they wanted to see if there was like health implications to reducing the cost of getting to the grocery store in these 2 parts of town, which are food insecure areas. We found that people went to different stores and they went to the grocery store more often. There was some change in like some of like the fresh produce purchases and things like that. I don't know if we can say that it was a huge health change, but definitely there was a change in the behavior of like how often they went to the grocery store and which one they chose to go to. People are still making trade-offs though, like some of these stores are a little bit more affordable than others. But if you don't have that expensive transportation cost, then maybe you can go to a store that has higher quality food. So unfortunately, it was just piloted, and I don't think the city plans on making it a permanent thing. I don't know if they felt that they had reached the people they had fully intended on reaching with the program. I was the external evaluator, so I had no involvement in the, implementation of it. I just got to use the fun data that was collected about that and say where people were going and do some focus groups and interviews. And then the last thing, our new mayor, who's like, he's very young, he's like, I think he's under 40 also. When he came to office, you have transition committees. So I was lucky enough to co-chair his transportation and infrastructure transition committee. So we were basically tasked with setting what should be his administration's priorities related to transportation, but we also had like waste and other water kind of fell under us too, internet access for his first term in office. So for the 4 years in the city. So that's the type of work that I like. I shouldn't say this here, but not very motivated by publications, but I really am motivated when I can make use of the work. And so I try to like partner a lot of times with some entity who can actually do something with the work that I do when it's all said and done. All right, yes.
Quick question about the lift access program.
Mhm.
How did people leave the grocery store? Did they also lift out?
Yep. We
Okay,
can take it both ways.
And
So
was it
$2.50 each way was subsidized.
thank you.
So they paid $2.50 and the city paid the rest.
Okay, so a $5 round trip.
Yeah, which is our transit fare. And
Makes
$2.50 was
sense.
our transit fare. Any other questions? It's paid through a couple of funds. The south one was paid through casino funds. There's a casino in that area. And then the west was city, city tax funds. So it was actually initially supposed to just be piloted in the west, but then through the casino special taxation district, they also joined in for that.
Sorry,
Mhm.
one more question about the
Yes,
wolf one.
please.
So could anyone just do that, or do they have to sign up through the pilot program?
They had to sign up, but there was no checks where we said, you had to have be below a certain income or anything. Literally it was just their address. If their address fell within the boundaries, they were approved. And it was kind of first come for the pilot. So there was like a wait list. It turns out that people were enrolled in the program and didn't actually know that they were enrolled in the program. Because I guess basically the enrollment was like how you go in your Lyft app, you get put in a coupon code type thing. It was like that, but they didn't know that was there in their app. And I guess there was some lapse in communication between Lyft and the city and who was supposed to notify the people per se. So we found we could see this person was signed up here, but then there was no trips taken until this date and all this. So there was a lot of lost time in the in terms of the use and utilization. So that was one of the recommendations that we had made for if it was to continue to have a formal onboarding process.
Yeah, for sure, that communication.
Yeah.
And how many people is not enrolled but used it?
Well, the west one, the top one was capped at 100 people, and the south at 50. And I think I would say maybe it was more like 75-40 who had ended up using. We ended up onboarding more because we saw that we weren't spending down enough. But the initial thoughts were 150 for each for the programs. All right, so alas, the e-bike study. Oh, okay. Yes.
From the previous one, like the mode hierarchy is like very common among practitioners. Like we like that a lot, but how do you feel that is like transferred or accepted or communicated to the society, and how is it accepted or not? And what would you do to like sell it better?
Good question. So when it was proposed, there was some questions, I think most of the questions were centered actually around parking questions. People were worried that this would mean that they would be taking away parking a lot. And so we had to answer a lot of questions about, that it's not affecting zoning. It had nothing to do with zoning codes and things like that. Everybody was fine with number one. Number one was fine. Number two was actually pretty okay, mostly because transit was there. Like if transit was not with cycling and micromobility, it would have been a much harder ask than having them all be on the same level. But yeah, the most complaints were just saying like, does this mean that we're gonna have more traffic or you're gonna take my parking away, was kind of where most of the questions were. And then there's other questions about if it changes funding and things. But yeah, it got through relatively easy compared to other legislation.
What was it prior, a different hierarchy or no?
No hierarchy. So basically, single occupancy vehicles, yeah, there was none before. All right, so everything I had talked about before was about Baltimore, and this one is not about Baltimore. This was in Richmond, Virginia. But the operator of Richmond's bike share was the same operator of Baltimore's bike share, so that's where that link came. This was a project through one of our university transportation centers. And Wigan is the operator of their bike share. And essentially they had a full, their initial bike share had no e-bikes, and they decided to transition to 100% e-bikes and wanted to kind of see what the impact of that transition would be. We did the study thinking, based on what we were initially told, that we would be past the 100% mark when the study would take place. That was not the case. They had delays. I think there were some shortages with some of the bikes coming and all sorts of things. So we basically end up looking at the transition as opposed to being more of a before and after sort of study. So it's a very new bike share. It opened in 2017. And then by 2019, they started to do the conversions from traditional bikes, e-bikes, which they call pedelec bikes, or the pedal assist bikes. So by the time, at the end of our study, it had gotten to about 65% of the bikes were converted to the e-bikes. And at that point, 90% of the trips, however, were taken by the e-bike. So there's still a pretty huge preference for the e-bike over the traditional ones. And so you see it's a pretty small system, only a little over 200 bikes in total, and they had 19 stations. The stations are mostly kind of in their urban downtown core, and then a couple stations kind of along some recreational areas, like Brown Island and Canal Walk are on the waterfront, but the rest are kind of more in like the downtown commercial areas. So this is their pricing structure. So they had various levels of passes. So pretty affordable. The annual pass was $96. Then you can have monthly and weekly passes. And for all those passes, basically if your ride was 45 minutes or less, you didn't pay anything. But if you did go over that, it cost you $3 for 30 minutes over. And then you had day passes. Go passes were similar as the day pass, except you still, it's kind of just like a one-way trip, but you could use the app basically to do it. So you still signed up and had, like, they had your information, but you paid by trip still. And then the regular one-way trip where you can go up to the kiosk and check out a bike. And you could check up to 4 bikes with the same card. All right, so the data that we had, unfortunately, we had absolutely no social demographic data about who the riders were. So that is the major limitation. We had data collected from April 2019 to December 2019. And so we knew the GPS data that we had, which was like, I think it being like every second. We knew when they took out the bike, what time, the distance in miles, duration in minutes. We had unique bike IDs to allow us to identify if it was traditional or the pedelec bike, cost of the trip. And then we did have unique IDs for the user. So even though we didn't know anything about the user, we could at least say that this was the same person taking this trip. So we ended up having only about 3,500 trips. So it's a small system. Across the whole time period, 64% were on the e-bikes, but the amount of e-bikes in the system had varied over that period. We filtered out really short trips, really long trips, and basically the recreational stations along the water were really popular, as well as this major commercial area at Broad and Harrison, were the stations that we saw the most number of trips kind of start and end at. So this is showing you kind of the evolution of what percent of trips were made each month. The green is the e-bike or the pedelec bikes. And so by the end of our study period, about 90% of the trips were on e-bike. And I may have forgotten to put in the percent of bikes that were pedelec, but by December, month 12, it was about 65% were pedelec, even though most of the trips were still on it. You can see when trips are made. So this one is Sunday, Monday, and then ends on Saturday. Should change that. So you can see that Saturday was the most popular day, and then kind of Friday and Sunday kind of even in terms of the total number of trips made. And then you can see the split. Now this was across all months, so it looks different because it was over that whole transition period. And then since we didn't know, we had no way of really interviewing the people or understanding like why they were making trips or anything. This was all done with just the GPS data. We decided to kind of group trips into 2 types, which we call OD and touring. So the OD trip was basically one that started and ended at a different station. And then the touring trips that we call, they started and ended at the same station, meaning you made a loop, basically. And so we figured that could be like a proxy for like, trip purpose and things like that. Assuming, if you were really using the trip to go from A to B, you would go from one station to another versus maybe for recreational type trips, you would return to the same station. And so we just looked at that by the different pass types. So you can see it's kind of ordered from longer term memberships and more shorter term. So you can see the longer term memberships did more of those origin destination type trips. And then when we got to like the day pass or the one-time trip where you're paying by the trip, you see a lot more of those touring trips where you start and end at the same station. The last 2 were special passes, so we ended up actually eliminating those from the analysis going forward. They had like some special kind of promotions to get people aware of bikes and things. So one was actually a pretty cool thing where they did a guided tour, look at all the murals in the city, and another one was like discounted passes. So basically we wanted to see, Was there any significant difference in trip characteristics based on bike type? Also wanted to understand, you know, how membership type and other user characteristics of which we didn't know anything about the actual person influence bike share use. And so we had all this GPS data. We use map boxes, matching APIs, basically snap that data to the roadway segments using OpenStreetMap. So then we could kind of query on like types of roads to see where they on, you know, bike lanes, local streets, those sort of things. We divided the trips into bike and pedelec trips, looked at trip length, speed. We looked at elevation, but Richmond, where the bikes are, is relatively flat, so there wasn't really much there on the elevation front. And then we compared to see some differences between the two bike types. And so this one was just looking at difference between bike and pedelec for the two categories of trip types that we did, which was the touring and the OD. So you can see here, like for example, for the touring trip, there was no significant difference in trip time between the e-bike and the traditional bike. Basically that 45-minute threshold was like the key. People try to get back before they had to pay. But they did travel much further, significantly further on the e-bike than they did on the traditional bike. And then also, conversely, the speeds was faster on those bikes. The elevation change, we found significant difference, but we really can't explain why. We did notice that like certain areas, like the recreational areas that are on the waterfront had very different elevation types than like in the downtown areas. So we don't really think there's anything we can make out of it in terms of like, you know, use and stress of riding. I think it's more so about differences in elevation based on where the stations were. So you can kind of ignore that row, but put it there for transparency's sake. And then you can see here for the origin destination trips, we noticed the average trip time is much lower on those than the ones who are starting and ending at the same station. Once again, speeds were higher. Also, they seem to be more the riders who were riding faster for the OD trips, which kind of goes towards they're probably people who were passes and were more familiar with biking than those who were just taking it out for a one-time try and things like that. And you can see that there still was some significant differences between the e-bike and the traditional. So this is just a map showing, and sorry it's a little difficult to see, but showing you where people chose to bike from. And I'm sorry, on this one I didn't include the stations, but on some of the other ones you'll see where the stations are, which is largely in that kind of purple dense area. So this long kind of trail here is actually a bike trail that kind of starts on the waterfront and goes down. So that's this part going towards the south. And then you can see the rest are kind of downtown. You do see that the e-bikes covered a higher percentage of the city, like people went further out than with the bikes. So then the next thing we did was kind of look at clustering based on membership types, where we looked at the people who are yearly members versus monthly, weekly, day passes, and then the pay by trip people to see, you know, what's different amongst the different groups. And so here we're looking at the percent of trips made by pedelec bikes. And so essentially what we found was all the past people, so annual, monthly, or weekly, there was really no difference between them in terms of what percent of trips, well, no statistical difference between the amount of trips that occurred. But then the passes did have a significantly lower amount, with the day pass having the least amount. So these were the people who usually did more touring trips and just paid a day pass to kind of explore the city. So they were less likely to use the e-bikes. and they use it about 50% of the time. And so one of the things that we're not clear as to why that is, so one of the things is the only way you could identify really the difference was to see the lightning bolt on the fin. And so if we had time or funds to do like a follow-up survey, we would really want to see like, do people realize who aren't regular riders, you know, what bike it was, or was it just chance that they just checked out, you know, certain bikes. This was looking at when trips are made. So what percent of trips were on the weekend as opposed to weekday. So as expected, you know, the longer term, like the annual and monthly member only did about 15 to 20% of their trips on the weekend, as opposed to those weekly, day, and one-way trip people. They did a lot more of their trips on the weekend. So basically, annual and monthly were very similar in their characteristics about weekday versus weekend, and then the weekly, day pass, and then the pay by trip people were all very similar. This was looking at trip time. So annual and monthly did much shorter trips as opposed to the weekly one way, and as expected, day pass people a little bit longer. You can see it was on average, it's like right at that 45 minute threshold. And they're all different from the other membership types. And then lastly, trip distance. So the weekly and the day pass people, their trips on average were higher than the others, around 3 to 3.5 miles. And then it got less, with the least number of miles actually being the monthly members, with the trip on average about 1.5 miles. So the last thing we did was a user cluster analysis. We did K-means clustering based on these 6 indicators. We actually are working on kind of redoing it to include, to also look at like some other things that we had that we didn't include in there. So we're working on a paper that should be out soon on that. But for this one that I'm reporting, it was these 3 things. So trip distance and time, percentage trips on the weekend, percent that were touring, what time they started on average, which we I think eliminated that or changed how we indicated it because morning and evenings kind of canceled each other out. So we didn't like how we did that. So we changed that in the one that's in the paper, and then the percentage of trips by pedaling. All right, so I ended up getting 6 clusters. I don't know why we did 0 to 5 instead of 1 to 6, but that's what we did. So clusters, you can see some of the differences there. So, you know, you have some people who like cluster group 4, who very much OD centered trips where they're starting from one station, going to another. The trips are much shorter in distance and time, as opposed to, you know, like group 2, where you have really long trips. They are mostly starting and ending from the same station, you know, very different characteristics from each other. So this, we also then mapped where each of the clusters were, and the black dots are where the stations are, just for to see relatively where they are. But I will zoom them out and talk about each on the next few slides. So so group 0, they basically kind of were the ones who were like just under that 45-minute threshold. They had pretty high use of the e-bikes. Over 71% of the trips were made by e-bike. Group 1 had a little bit lower pedelec use rates, and their trips are much shorter on average than the other group, where theirs around the 30-minute mark. You can see group 2, these trips were on the weekend. These were those people who are really long in both distance and time. So you can see how far across the city they were able to cover. And these trips largely occurred on the weekend and were very long in both distance and time. And they almost always started and ended at the same station. And then the third one, also mostly touring trips, not necessarily occurring on the weekend. It was about 50 split. And they were long trips, but not as long as the other ones. These are kind of those, they were long enough that they were over the 45-minute threshold. Now, group 4, you can see these trips are really condensed where the stations are. These were the trips that started and ended at different stations. Most of those trips were made on the weekday, and they were very short trips, 15 minutes, a little over a mile for group 4. And then group 5 were long trips, but they were slower. So they didn't cover as many miles for the length of time that they were out. Still mostly started and ended at the same station, but you can also see they were done on e-bikes, which explains why the distance was less for the length of time that they had checked out the bikes. And so those were 6 groups. So we would love to do a follow-up. We actually have reached out to the city to see if they had completed everything, so we could do something like deeper going forward. We would love to do a study to look, and now that they've completed their transition, plus COVID has kind of normalized, I'll say, and try to do one where we can actually interview users and try to link their travel data to user characteristics. So we're reaching out to them to see if we can kind of do a follow-up, because unfortunately, the thing that I most disliked was the fact that they had no user characteristics. But it was still some interesting things in terms of, the importance of different types of membership types when it comes to who you're trying to reach, right? So, having day passes and things for like tourists versus, the longer term memberships, people who are using very short trips, kind of showed some importance there. And then just kind of where the longer recreational type trips were occurring and when is important for looking at how to distribute your bikes and so forth. So that's where this study ended. We're very much hoping to continue it in the future. Are there any questions?
This might have been on the slide where you showed the payment schemes, but was there a price difference between the regular bicycles and the e-bikes?
No. No price difference.
First off, thank you so much. Second off, how can planners, practitioners, and academics work together to design projects and studies like this that are not going to get upset when, or they're not going to get hampered rather when the implementation doesn't go to plan, or that are a little more resilient to things going wrong?
Good question. Yeah, so this one, we definitely had the backing of the city because they had approved to have access to the data. There was no public interaction, so I don't think they really were too worried. Decision had already been made, it was already done. It was more like for their knowledge. I don't know if we would get more pushback for the interview process, or maybe some other issues may come to light. But generally we found that most cities do want to do better. Like, people think that, really most people who are working in agencies want things to work out. And so I think for us, the biggest piece was just data sharing. They were very interested in can we have access to the data and analysis? So the GPS data they had never touched at the city. So that was one of the reasons they agreed. It was, for them, it was beyond what they had the resources to do. So they were very much just interested in seeing what the GPS data looked like. And for them, that was enough to agree to the study because they had never looked at it in-house.
Is the system a public service? Who's the operator operating for? Is
The
it
city.
It's a city-run
Yeah,
program?
city contract.
Okay, so it's contracted out to a private operator?
Yep.
that's running that?
Yep.
Cool, because
So-
those rates are really cheap.
Yes, they're basically transit rates.
Yep.
So yeah, it's contracted by the city, basically to kind of supplement their transit service.
So I noticed that you partner a lot with the cities.
And so can you tell us more like how do you manage that relationship to like keep those projects going, that it's good for them and good for you as well to like influence policy?
Yeah, good question. So a lot of relationship building. I sometimes go in with like thoughts of ideas of stuff that I want to study, but I don't tie myself to it. So a lot of times there'll be conversations about trying to identify issues that we can tackle together. So I found that if I'm not prescriptive in what I want to do, it tends to work out better. So just really knowing like what are your issues, kind of some brainstorming about, well, I would love to see this data. These are the types of questions we can answer with this data if we had it. Is this useful to you? Is there anything else you want us to add to it? So sometimes I'll add questions that I may not necessarily be all that interested in, but it's something they're interested in. So particularly like for surveying work and things like that, allowing them to put in some other questions and things. So yeah, it's really just kind of co-creating the problems that we're looking at.
Thank you for coming and sharing on the 3 topics.
Yes,
I learned a lot. Why do you think there's like a day pass and then a month pass and not a weekly pass? It's significant like tourism or tourism?
Yeah, I think they have weekly. Let me confirm. I'm pretty sure they do have a weekly pass.
Weekly pass.
So annual, monthly, and weekly.
$12.
Yeah.
And the second question is on the city investing in the e-bikes when they already had a bike system working. For me, it's surprising, maybe I'm biased. Why not scooters or any other micromobility initiative? And again, I'm very surprised that they would invest in this. I don't know the cost, but that they, from lunch, that people didn't even know it was happening. So
Yeah.
was just like they're curious or they really wanted, what were the
Was
goals?
the motive? Yeah, good question. So I think the motive is to increase ridership. And so they wanted to make sure that, physical ability wasn't hindering people from riding, and making kind of more accessible to who may be concerned about, sweating and things or being in shape enough to ride the bikes. And I'm trying to think from a contracting point of view, I'm not sure how much more expensive it was, like with the partnering with the operator. I think the operators were switching over a lot of their systems to e-bikes. So I'm not sure if the incremental cost of the city were that different either. They should be. I know it was a little bit more expensive, but I don't think it was wasn't like double the cost per bike or anything like that. But I think it was more like an equity kind of reasoning for making the switch.
So you say like the regular bike versus the e-bike is not even double?
It's like for the operator costs, it wasn't double.
And last, and again, sorry to be sensitive. I also have a baby swimming.
No.
No sleeping tonight. So sorry, but so the ridership increase?
So in our study period, it did not, but we only looked from April to December, so we had the weather getting colder at the same time of the transition. So that's another reason I want to go back. So at our time, it was pretty stagnant, but the weather was also changing. So I actually do think it probably would show an increase in ridership in the same summer months, because it went down, but I don't think it went down at the same levels in the winter months as it had previously. But we didn't get 2 same seasons to look at.
You said this was the same operator that's in Baltimore.
That was in
Think you
Baltimore.
wanna keep this in Baltimore, the study?
So we want to repeat it in Richmond because Baltimore no longer has a docked bike share. We're 100% dockless now for many reasons, maintenance issues, bikes being tossed in the harbor. Like at some point they had paused it because they didn't have enough bikes that were well working to be stocked. And then they just decided to just axe the whole program and go dockless. And there's also some equity issues about where the stations were and how you could put more stations, more areas in the dockless model.
Yeah, on a completely different topic, I'm really curious about the undergrad transportation program that you guys have at Morgan State and sort of the curriculum, but also sort of the educational innovation that you guys have going on there, sort of doing something that's very different than a lot of other places.
Yeah, happy to talk about it. So the pros, I'll do pros and cons. The pros are basically our students learn a lot more about transportation at the undergraduate levels. You know, in civil, you usually have maybe like 2 required transportation classes by the time you graduate. Our students have like 50 credit hours of transportation classes, so like 50 of their 120. So that's the benefit, you know, they get to learn a lot more engineering, planning, etc. There are some cons. Being the only one, we struggle with like the HR filter, where you know HRs are trained to look for a degree in civil engineering or city planning to then get to the people who would actually make final decisions. And so we found that like sometimes our students don't get to the interview stage, they don't make it past the HR filter, even though the employers really like what they get, they don't get to the people who understand the degree, they don't make it that far. So that's been the con. And we actually ended up starting a second track. So we were applied and natural science accredited, and we are now have a second track that's engineering accredited, which basically meant we had to reduce our transportation classes to get more general engineering classes, to allow them to meet the requirements for engineering accreditation, which then allows them to get their EIT, engineering and training certificate, and things like that. So we actually had to drop the transportation to have more higher, like we did a higher physics and things like that, statics, dynamics, those sort of things that, I mean, do you need statics and dynamics for most of what we do? Not really. So yeah, making those trade-offs to check the boxes to be able to take your EIT, things like
So
that.
if they take an EIT, they can sit for the civil PE? Like what PE would they eventually?
Yeah, so we've had a few who've done, we've had one who did civil, we had more that did general.
Oh, so there's a general, I forgot that. Okay.
And then they take, and then, yeah, they could definitely take the transportation PE, but at the EIT level, I think the general is easier for them than the civil. So we do something that they get some geotag, they get some water through like drainage and some of those classic, you know, infrastructure transportation topics, but bridge and trenches, they couldn't do, you know, there's a lot of other things that they would struggle with. But it's new. I think we haven't had a graduate of that program yet take the EIT. So we'll see if we change it enough that it's even worth the change. But just having engineering has been helpful because the degree says transportation engineering instead of transportation systems. So that does help them get through HR easier, even though there's not much difference in the 2 curriculums on paper.
Well, back to the study, how do you measure if there was any people that took a bike instead of a car?
Yeah, so we did not look at any mode shifts. Yeah, for this study, mode shifts was not part of, because we didn't do any interviews or anything to be able to really
Exactly, like
understand,
that. That's how
yeah.
you would do it, right? You have to ask them.
Yeah.
Somebody. It's a good idea.
I have a question. I've been thinking about your finding that more of the daily pass and sort of these shorter term passes ended up with the traditional bikes instead of the e-bikes. But then you also said that more of them were on the weekend. Is the weekend usage so high that they might not have been able to get an
It's
e-bike if they
possible.
wanted it?
Yeah, it's possible. The weekend was definitely the busiest, particularly Saturday.
Okay.
So there may have been some outages, particularly at the busy stations, but there was about 3 of the stations were very popular. And so that could also be a factor, which actually I think we could look at that, because I think we did have, I know we know the number of bikes that were available. I'm trying to think if I knew the identifier of the bikes that were available. We may not have known the identifier, which might be why we didn't look at it, but we did know the number that were in a station at a given time. Alright. Yes, sorry.
Oh, so I was wondering, what was the goal of the project? Is it only to like cater the original user base and cater them towards e-bikes, or like attracting more environmental friendly like new user base? Like, is there any marketing took place for?
Speak about from the point of view of the city, what their goal was.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think, I don't know if it was so much of sustainability, I think it was more of an equity based motivation. And equity to get more users, so trying to solve some of the barriers to biking. But yeah, it was kind of at the point where we were talking, they had already decided to make the transition, so I'm not fully clear as to their motivation for doing so.
Yeah, I mean, I was wondering if they wanted to like phase out like regular bikes with e-bikes, or if they wanted to, attract more people will be interested.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was definitely to attract more people to biking in general, as opposed to just wanting to phase out the traditional ones.
Kind of education. I had noticed, like, living in a short time in DC, that it was and in Massachusetts too, more people of color in transportation, and now you're telling us that it's the only undergrad in transportation. Like, what's the correlation?
Oh, in
Like,
terms
the
of,
motive?
for doing the program?
For having undergrad in transportation, and to have more people in the field, like,
Yeah.
is there a love for it more than, is there a connection between transportation, any racial historical reason?
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know if that was the motivation. I should ask our chair, because it was his brainchild. So I think the idea behind it is basically, right now, you kind of have to get a master's for really in-depth training in transportation. And we don't know why that's the case. Like, so just kind of getting back to some of the classes you take as a CE.
That's what I'm thinking, to get people into the job faster.
Do you need all those classes if you know for sure what you want? Like, there's definitely a clear reason for having a CE path. Like, I took that path coming out of high school. I did not know I wanted to do transportation, so it was good for me to be exposed to the different, types of engineering fields you could go into. But for somebody who knows, why do they need to suffer through all the rest of the classes? So I think that was kind of the motivation, and then you can get them exposed to more elements within the field. Right, so like our students take 4-step modeling, they also know, all the highway design and geometric design stuff. So they get like stuff that you would get in planning, as well as stuff that you would get in engineering, without needing to flip flop or minor in one program, major in another. That was the motivation. I mean, in terms of just the importance of Morgan State, definitely transportation, particularly when you're looking at like transit and things, it's urban, right? And urban areas look very different than, the country at large. And so we do think it's really important that people who are going out and working in the communities look more like the community. And so we've been very able to position ourselves very well, where we are training a lot of African-American students who come from the neighborhoods we're trying to improve. They know the problems. Like, when I had my study on the schools, like, my students were like, yeah, it used to take me an hour and 20 minutes to get to school. Or, we didn't like to transfer on that side of town because of, different issues and things. So it's helpful to have that experience. And so one of the things I tell my students, we'll go to TRB and things, they're like, okay, you may be the only one in the room, but it's valuable. That experience that you have is valuable, and just to make use of it. We're attracting now a lot of students who were like bus operators. And so they were bus operators. They may now be more of a managerial role, but they kind of reached the glass ceiling, as opposed to how much higher they can go on the managerial side. And so they come to our program. And so that's been really good. And they bring such great, life experience to the program that's very useful even for us. And we tweak the program based on their experiences, and, they become our board members and things. So that's been good too.
And are those undergraduate students, or are those coming into the master's program?
Both.
Okay.
So we'll get them as undergrads who don't have a degree. Then we also get people, because transportation is one of those things people often just fall into. Like, you're in a parallel field and you find out that transportation is kind of important to it, then you end up working in it. And so they may want an actual degree, because they ended up working in the industry, and they'll come for the master's. So we don't like require you to come from transportation background for our master's program, so we get that at the master's level.
We have a couple of interesting online questions.
Okay.
So I'm gonna give them-
So I'm gonna ask questions, I don't know if you've already addressed this, I apologize.
No problem.
I'll go ahead and ask this. Okay, so while we collect usage, this is from Lindell Price, while we collect usage and safety data for motor vehicles at the state and national level, we do not similarly collect usage and safety data for bicycling and for walking. How can we improve the data available for bicycling and walking safety? Did that make sense?
So yes, very true. Bike ped data is lacking to the same level. I mean, part of it is, vehicles have things that allow you to collect big data a little bit easier. And then a lot of the, I guess, private sources of data, like your street light and like your kind of cell phone based data is out there. There's issues of equity and things when you make use of that data for planning that, kind of gotta be careful about, and they're expensive to have access to. But I think cities just have to make an effort to do so. I mean, that's one of the things that went under the Complete Streets Modal thing, hierarchy plan, was to have more funds to do like bike ped counts. And so like we have like some counters that we put in certain parts of the city, but it's still way lacking. And then in terms of like safety data, there's a lot of training that needs to be done, particularly with like police officers and what gets reported. And also letting people know that, call the police, for like pedestrian related injuries and things like that. But we found like looking at like some police reports at some point, like how incomplete they are a lot of times for bike ped related crashes. And so there's a lot of training that can be done too.
And we have one more here. Do you have information on the amount of exercise people get using pedal assist electric bicycles versus traditional bicycles? I've heard that people using pedal assist electric bicycles ride farther or faster, but average the same amount of exercise as people riding traditional bicycles, but I do not know the source.
I don't know personally. I'm not sure for our program. I mean, we did find that they were able to go further in the same amount of time, so maybe it evens out in terms of the amount of energy exerted, but we didn't look at it. But they did go further in the same part of time periods, but I don't know. Anybody else has looked at that? I haven't.
I can send him a study. I think we have his email because he comes to a lot of the studies.
Okay,
So there's one that I worked on that I can send him. So
I'm sure somebody has looked at
College of
that.
Charleston, there's some researchers in health
Okay.
who've looked at the differences that I worked on the study with.
I would use less exercise.
Well, but that's just, it is like a lot of times people sort of have this window of how much exertion they're willing to do. And so then we see in studies
Further.
like the one that Celeste did that they just go further, right? So like they go, a similar amount of time,
Does it even
exert
out,
a similar amount, but they get to go further. So, yeah.
Good question.
Super. I think we're bumping right up against 3, so unless somebody had a burning question in the room, can we thank